How do I feel about so many people seeing my penis? I feel that it is pretty cool because, you know, it's the best kind because no one knows about it. You can be in the gym and then Nirvana comes on and then you can't be like, hey, that's me on the, you know, because you're like, ah, that's me, bitches. You know, like, it's chill.
So I think it's safe to say that everyone and their grandmother is familiar with Nirvana's second album, Nevermind. It's pretty much a modern day classic, and in addition to some truly iconic music, it features one of the most memorable covers, arguably of all time, at least in my own personal view. The cover features a completely nude baby with its arms outstretched, swimming underwater, chasing a dollar bill on a fishhook. The cover is iconic not only due to its somewhat shocking imagery, but because it symbolizes so many things to so many different people. To some, the cover might symbolize capitalism or the American dream, greed. To others, it might symbolize birth or rebirth, innocence. To me, the cover has always symbolized the idea that even something so innocent as a baby who has no concept of material possessions could still be entranced by the call of the almighty dollar. But to the baby, Spencer Eldon, who is now 30 years old, the cover symbolized something darker, something perverse. It symbolized sexual exploitation of a minor. At least so Spencer is now alleging, as he's suing whoever was affiliated with that iconic cover for the sale and distribution of, let's just call it CP for the purposes of this video, so it doesn't get flagged on some YouTube hit list. So the big question everyone's kind of asking about this lawsuit is, isn't it too late to file a lawsuit? I mean, it's been 30 years, dude. Well, I think the bigger question is the cover actually art? Or is it CP? Where do we draw the line? Does this present another conflict between free expression and government control of speech? To answer these questions, let's lay out some of the facts. So our little story begins 30-something years ago when Kurt Cobain, the frontman of Nirvana for the 2 or 3 of you out there that don't know, was sitting somewhere, I imagine in his living room, watching a documentary on underwater childbirth. And I just imagine he's completely grossed out by what he's watching. So he says, you know what's a good idea? Let's put this on our album cover. And so the idea was born. But it turned out images of underwater childbirth were a bit too graphic, even for the 90s. And it was also a bit more expensive to license these images from a stock image house. So instead, the art director who was putting together the cover, Robert Fisher, sent photographer Kirk Weddle to a pool to take pictures of babies underwater. Now, the reason I'm sort of providing this context is because whether it will have any effect on the lawsuit is yet to be seen, but this story at least indicates that there wasn't a sexual intent behind the artistic vision for the cover. It was born out of the idea of underwater childbirth, at least as originally conceived, at least as these parties have sort of represented over the years, over 30 years in interviews and things of that nature. So the photographer, Weddle, allegedly did things the old-fashioned way, by paying somewhere around $250 to some parents so that he could photograph their infants underwater. To my understanding, the parents were actually involved as well. They were in the water, holding their kids, setting up the shots, and you can actually see the handprint of whoever was holding Spencer Eldon in the album cover. They tried, there was no Photoshop, so they couldn't really take that out completely. So in other words, it seemed like kind of a family-friendly affair, nothing nefarious going on. I definitely don't think anyone was under the impression they were shooting pictures of CP. So Fisher and Nirvana eventually settled on a particular image due to a particular baby's positioning, the look on the baby's face, and the way that his arms were stretched out like he was reaching for something. Of course, that baby was Spencer Eldon. There was also some discussion of what the baby should be reaching for, and eventually someone kind of pitched the idea of a dollar bill, and everyone thought, hey, that seems kind of cool. And the image was used for the cover, obviously, and it went on to be known worldwide. And it's even featured in the Museum of Modern Art, which is ironic because the baby in the picture, Spencer Eldon, became an artist himself, and now he's suing about a cover that's in the Museum of Modern Art. Spencer actually seemed pretty favorable towards Nirvana over the years. He recreated the image over the years, in bathing trunks of course, and he generally seemed to hold a favorable opinion of Nirvana. Spencer gave interviews expressing his general admiration of Nirvana over the years, and he even went as far as getting the album's name, Nevermind, tattooed on his chest. But somewhat understandably, it seems Spencer was getting a little bit fed up with always being that Nirvana baby.
I went to a baseball game on opening day at the Dodgers, and I was looking out at all the people, and I was like, had a moment where I was like, man, all these people have seen my baby penis when I was a baby. So it's pretty crazy. It'd be nice to have a quarter for every person that has seen my baby penis, but...
So Spencer sued the following parties and just ahead of the 30-year anniversary of the album. So the claims Spencer brought were for commercial child exploitation, or more specifically, possessing CP, transporting CP, receiving or distributing CP, reproducing CP. So you get the idea. Most of these claims are related to the fact that, hey, this image is CP and they've done all these different things with it, which is why I think this is the big issue and the big question that this whole thing is going to turn on. So the first issue in this case, before we get into all that, is whether the plaintiff's claims are time barred by the statute of limitations. Is it too late to bring this lawsuit? Well, here's what the statute says. Statute states, any action shall be barred unless the complaint is filed not later than 10 years after the date the plaintiff discovered the later of, that's kind of the key phrase, the violation that forms the basis of the claim, or the injury that forms the basis for the claim. So, in other words, the argument is it's when he discovered the violation that forms the basis for the claim. If the violation is distributing CP, which is the cover, that violation keeps occurring probably every day when someone buys the album cover. So the statute of limitations restarts, and he has another 10 years from every sale of the album to bring a claim. So I don't think it would be too late to bring these claims by any means. Now, with that in mind, some of the claims, at least against some of the parties, might be time barred. It might be too late to bring a claim against someone like the photographer, who basically the only injury that he caused was taking the picture, which occurred 30 years ago. It would be kind of unfair to all of a sudden bring a claim against someone 30 years after the fact, after his involvement has essentially ended. But the big question, the big issue, is the image CP? Well, to answer this, the court will likely look at something called the dosed factors. The dosed factors control whether an image is art or something sexually explicit. And if you read through the plaintiff's complaint, you quickly begin to see that he's actually setting out the basis for these factors in the way he frames the facts. So let's kind of look at these one by one. So factor number one, was the focal point on the child's genitals? So was the focus on the private parts? Well, the complaint provides these facts to possibly suggest it was. Fisher admired, and I quote, the positioning, the look on the baby's face, the way that his arms were stretched out, like he was reaching for something. Like other controversial album covers, the defendants sought to garner attention with an explicit image which intentionally focused on Spencer's carefully positioned, enlarged genitals. The implication here being argued is that the positioning was chosen because it places the baby's genitals in the center of the image. In other words, they could have chosen any kind of angle for this cover. They could have chosen a sideways angle where you don't see the genitals. They could have chosen some kind of angle where the genitals were obscured, but no, they chose this picture because the genitals were front and center. And you'll notice they're also referencing other controversial album covers at this time. They actually specifically state what those album covers are, and I can put some of those up on the screen maybe, but it's kind of an interesting argument. I think they're trying to say that there was a trend of going for this shock value of just having nude babies on the cover, and it wasn't really about some kind of artistic vision. It was just about shocking your audience because that was the trend at the time. So that's kind of an interesting argument. I think this factor is one of the few that leans in their favor. I don't think the other ones are going to be as strong in their favor here. And by they, I mean the plaintiff. So factor number two, is the setting sexually suggestive? So the setting for the image was in a pool at the Pasadena Aquatic Center in California. So I don't think there's anything suggestive in a swimming pool. Now the court will also consider the pose in the picture under this factor. So the complaint posits that Cobain chose the image depicting Spencer like a sex worker, grabbing for a dollar bill that is positioned dangling from a fishhook in front of his nude body, with his penis explicitly displayed. So this line suggests the pose somehow implies the baby looks like a sex worker. I'm not sure how strong this argument is. I don't know if you immediately associate money with sex work. I guess if you're nude plus money, it equals sex work, and they chose that position, so that's where they're trying to convey here. I'm not buying this argument. I don't think it was a sexually suggestive setting, but who knows. Factor number three, is the child in inappropriate attire for their age? Well, I think this factor could go either way. I mean, given the fact this is a baby we're talking about, it might actually be more appropriate for the baby to be nude than if the child was, let's say, 10 years old. So I think this factor is kind of a tie. Factor number four, was the child actually nude? Well, yes, this undoubtedly leans in their favor. The child was nude. Factor number 5. Does the child's conduct suggest coyness or willingness to engage in sexual activity? So the complaint might be trying to suggest that the picture somehow suggests that the child is willing to engage in sexual activity with this sentence. Nirvana ultimately decided to use a dollar bill on a fishhook as a prop after an extensive debate between the use of a dollar bill, raw meat, a dog, and other objects commonly associated with prurient interests. In short, maybe the choice of the fishhook and the dollar bill were somehow meant to suggest willingness to engage in sexual activity. I mean, let's look at it this way. They could have chosen anything for the baby to be reaching for. Could have been a teddy bear, could have been a rattle, something like that. But they decided to choose a dollar bill. So out of all those things, they were trying to go for something provocative. So final factor number 6, whether the image was meant to elicit a sexual response in the viewer. So this is kind of a tricky factor because who's to say what kind of response each viewer would have? So the complaint states the following to argue this point. To ensure the album cover would trigger a visceral sexual response from the viewer, Weddle activated Spencer's gag reflex before throwing him underwater in poses highlighting and emphasizing Spencer's exposed genitals. So I think this is a pretty weak argument. To my understanding, the gagging of a baby when swimming is used as a technique to ensure the baby breathes out underwater and doesn't drown. So they're kind of trying to argue that because the baby was gagged and, its mouth was open or something, that was meant to elicit a sexual response in the viewer, but it's kind of a weird argument if you ask me, and I don't think it's particularly strong either. So keep in mind that the plaintiff doesn't have to show all these factors lean in his favor in showing the image is a lascivious exhibition of the genitals or a pubic area. The court will look to the overall content of the image. So if you take all these factors together, is it sexually explicit or not? With that said, I don't think the factors are likely to lean in the plaintiff's favor here. The only factor that really leans in their favor is the fact that the baby was nude, and maybe the fact that the genitals were clearly kind of in the center of the image. They weren't obscured or anything like that. However, I don't think there's anything sexually suggestive about having one's arms outstretched or chasing a dollar bill or swimming. I mean, taking the factor that the baby was nude and that clearly there was no effort to obscure the nudity isn't enough if you consider the plethora of nude images of children we see in artwork throughout history, for which the goal isn't to elicit a sexual response. I don't think anyone would consider a painting of, baby Jesus or something as a sexually explicit image. So if you take that image, what would you have to add to it to make it sexually explicit? What if you add a dollar bill? What if you add a fishhook? What if you have the baby's arms outstretched? I don't think any of those things taken alone or together make an image that isn't sexually explicit into something that is. And I think it would be pretty hard to find anyone who purchased the album cover for a sexually driven reason, which is probably usually the case with CP. So in conclusion, I don't think there's a particularly strong case for this image being CP. Even if these claims are likely to fail though, that doesn't mean we should assume Spencer Eldon brought this claim to score a quick buck and that he doesn't actually feel the way he feels. Sure, people might have their doubts given the fact, he's always been a fan of Nirvana, he tattooed the name of the album on his chest, he could have maintained anonymity, but he's the one who kind of chose to recreate the image and give interviews, and he generally placed himself in the public eye as the baby from the album. But I think things change and people are complicated beasts. He may have chosen to embrace something that made him uncomfortable to somehow diminish its power over him. He may have not realized what he was embracing until years later. Something is or isn't necessarily CP because of how we feel about it 1 year versus the next. It either fits these factors or it doesn't. So how he felt over the years might not necessarily be vital to whether this is CP or not. With that said, the image might legally be found to not be CP, but that doesn't mean it doesn't feel like that to the plaintiff, Spencer Eldon. If that's the case, well, I think we should all feel some empathy for his situation. And if it's not the case, and Spencer is just really trying to earn a quick dollar and he doesn't even believe this is really CP, well, then never mind.